Okay, good day. In this video, you will learn the fourth and last type of conic section, and this is a hyperbola. You will also learn the definition and the different parts of a hyperbola. But first, let me give you the learning outcomes of our lesson. Okay? At the end of the lesson, you will be able to define a hyperbola, to determine the standard form and general equation of a hyperbola, derive the equation of hyperbola. The fourth is you will be able to graph a hyperbola in a rectangular coordinate system. And lastly, you will be able to solve situational problems involving conic sections, specifically a hyperbola. Okay, so let's start our lesson by defining hyperbola. Ano ba ang hyperbola? It says a hyperbola is a set of all points in a plane such that the difference of the distances of each point of the set from the two fixed points is constant. The fixed points are called the foci. So, ibig sabihin, if we're going to determine the distance of any point on the hyperbola from the two fixed points called the foci, it is always constant. And that constant value is 2a. So, to give you more about uh, to better understand the definition of a hyperbola, I have here the illustration of a hyperbola. Now, if we have point P, which has the coordinates of x, comma y, and we're going to determine the distance of this point P from f sub 2 or focus 2 of the hyperbola, and if we're going to determine the distance of this point P from the other focus f sub 1, and we're going to call that distance as d sub 2. And if we're going to get the difference of these two distances, it is always equal to a constant value. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, d1 minus d sub 2 is equals to 2a. Yung constant value natin is the 2a. Ano ba yung a? Yung a, yun yung distance from the center to the vertex of a hyperbola. So, ganun din yun. A din ang ginagamit natin sa ellipse na notation na yun ay yung distance of the vertex to the center of an ellipse. Dito naman, distance naman ito ng center to the vertex of the hyperbola. So, ibig sabihin, from the center of the hyperbola to one of the vertices, ang sukat nun is A. So, ibig sabihin, from vertex 2 to vertex 1, that is equivalent to 2A. So, that is the constant value. Okay. If you still remember, sa ellipse, constant din yung sum of the two distances, any point on the hyperbola from the foci. Okay, so that is PF1 plus PF2 is equals to a constant value. Again, the constant value is equal to 2a. And a is the distance from the center to the vertex of an ellipse. So kung dun sa ellipse ay sum of the distances is equals to 2a, sa hyperbola, the difference of the two distances, any point on the hyperbola from the foci is equals to 2a also. So dito is sum sa ellipse, sa hyperbola is difference. Okay. So here are the parts of a hyperbola. We have, the first one is the center. Ano ba yung center? It's the point where the two asymptotes intersect, or it can be defined as the intersection of the transverse and conjugate axes. Okay? Okay. So I have here an illustration showing the center of a hyperbola. So ito yung center niya. No? Kataon, yung ating hyperbola, center niya is located at 0, 0, or origin niya is located dun sa, yung center niya is located at the origin of the xy plane. But there are hyperbolas na ang center niya is located not on the origin but somewhere on the plane, At ang ginagamit nating notation is center at HK. Okay? Nasaan yung center? Ito yung ating asymptotes. Okay? Itong dalawang to. Yung intersection ng dalawang asymptotes, yun yung tinatawag nating center of the hyperbola. Okay? Next, we have vertices and transverse axis. For the vertices, the points of the hyperbola with the transverse axis are called vertices. Ibig sabihin, kung nasaan yung transverse axis natin, naroon yung vertices natin. Okay? Kasi yung transverse axis natin, yun yung line segment joining the vertices. Okay? So we have the next is latera recta. Are the line segments passing through the foci and perpendicular to the transverse axis. So, doon sa ating ellipse, lateral recta rin ang ginagamit. At yung lateral recta natin sa ellipse, same din dito sa definition of the hyperbola na lateral recta. Dadaan din sa foci, perpendicular dito sa transverse axis. Yung transverse axis kasi tinutukoy sa ellipse is major axis. Ganun din, perpendicular din siya sa major axis ang tawag sa ellipse, dito transverse axis. Okay? So, ito yung ating center, again. Ito yung ating vertices. At yung vertices natin, nandun siya sa transverse axis. At ito yung ating latera recta. Perpendicular siya sa transverse axis at dadaan din sa focus of the hyperbola. Ang haba from vertex to vertex is 2a. Ibig sabihin, yun din yung haba ng ating transverse axis. Half of the transverse axis is the distance from center to vertex, which is equivalent to 2a. We have the length of the latera recta is 2b squared over a. Okay, so from endpoint to endpoint of the latera recta, 2b squared over a. But from focus to one point of the end, one point ng ating latera recta is b squared over a. Okay. Next, we have the conjugate axis. It is the line segment which is perpendicular bisector of the transverse axis. Okay. We have the focal length. It is the line segment joining the foci with the length 2c. Okay. Ito yung ating conjugate axis. Okay. Bisector siya ng ating transverse axis. Ito yung transverse axis natin. Perpendicular bisector C, conjugate axis. So, ito yung endpoints of the conjugate axis. Okay? Yung focal length naman, that is the distance from focus to focus. That is equivalent to 2c. From center to focus, ang haba niya naman ay c. Of course, yung ating conjugate axis, ang haba niya from endpoint to endpoint is 2b. But from center to one endpoint of the conjugate axis is equals to b. Parang kagaya rin ng sa ellipse natin. Tinatawag lang natin sa ellipse yung conjugate axis na minor axis. At yung kalahati niya, semi-minor axis. Yung transverse axis dito sa hyperbola, tinatawag natin major axis sa ellipse. At yung kalahati ng length nun is the semi-major axis. We have the last is the asymptotes, are the lines that pass through the center of the hyperbola and are asymptotic to the curves. Okay? Napakita ko na, na-illustrate ko na kung ano yung asymptote kanina. Hindi ko lang nabanggit is this asymptotes is a line. At the same time, asymptotic siya dun sa ating curve. Ibig sabihin, hindi siya magta-touch dun sa ating curve of the hyperbola. Papalapit siya ng papalapit dun sa curve, but it will not intersect the curve. Okay? Yun yung kanyang asymptote. At ang asymptote, laging tatama sa center of the hyperbola. Okay? Yan yung mga parts ng ating hyperbola. We have the center, that is the intersection of the asymptotes. of the hyperbola, or that is the intersection of the transverse axis and the conjugate axis. From vertex to vertex, yun yung ating transverse axis. At ang haba nun ay 2a. Okay? Conjugate axis natin from this point up to this point, yun yung length of the conjugate axis, which is equals to 2b. We have the focus. From focus to focus, ang distance niya is 2c. We have the lateral recta, which is equivalent to the length of lateral recta is 2b squared over a. So, okay. So, yan yung mga parts of a hyperbola. Napakalaga ng lahat nito in sketching the graph of a hyperbola. For simplicity, the following will be represented as C, capital letter C for the center of the hyperbola, F sub 1 and F sub 2 for the foci, V sub 1 and V sub 2, the vertices, B1 and B2, ito yung endpoints of the conjugate axis, point P, x, y, any point along the hyperbola, okay? E sub 1, E sub 2, E sub 3, E sub 4, endpoints of the lateral recta, ganyan din ginamit natin sa ellipse. A sub 1, A sub 2, ito yung bago natin notation. This is for the equation of the asymptotes. A, distance from the center to vertex. B, distance from center to one endpoint of the conjugate axis. C, distance from center to focus. 2A, length of the transverse axis. Ito yung vertex to vertex. 2B, length of the conjugate axis. Ito yung B sub 1 to B sub 2. And hindi nakasulat dito yung 2C. Yung 2C ay the focal length. That is the distance from focus to the other focus. So, that is yun yung mga parts of a hyperbola. It is very important in sketching the graph of a hyperbola. In my next video, I'm going to show you the derivation of the equation of a hyperbola. So, thank you.